Hello, this BTEC Sport and Exercise Science video is for Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and we are looking at the skeletal system. This particular video looks at D5 joints, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the three classifications of joints that you need to know and understand. First of all, perhaps it's important to recognise what is a joint. Well, it's defined as a place where two or more bones meet, and the posh name for a joint is an articulation. Many joints in our body allow us to move, so without two bones joining together we wouldn't be able to move, but just be mindful that not all joints allow movement, and we've got a lot of joints in our body. Now the joints are designed for typically allowing a lot of movement, or for being fairly stable, or somewhere in between those two. So kind of joints are typically more for mobility, moving, or for stability, less about movement, I guess, trying to be structured so that they are relatively stable and don't get damaged. And the diagram on the right there gives a sense of which ones are for which. We've obviously got a huge range of movement, or lots of mobility in our hips and our shoulder joints. They are ball and socket joints. They are designed to have a big range of movement. Whereas our elbow is only really allows movement in one sort of plane, that flexion and extension movement. And whilst it does move, it's similarly with our knees, of course, it's more to do with stability. Our pelvic area very much is for stability. We've got a lot of important organs in there that we want to be protected. We don't want to be vulnerable to excessive movement. So we've got a lot of fibrous joints in there, or some cartilaginous joints that don't move very much. And again, the bones between our feet, between the bones of our feet, I should say, are relatively for stability. We want them to be strong and sturdy. Just to give you a sense, when we describe joints, we might need to refer to how much range of movement they allow, or whether they are more for stability. So let's look at the three classifications of joints that you need to be able to recognise. Now, joints are classified by their design, by their structure, how they're built, and how they're structured influences how much they can or can't move, kind of what job they're designed to do. So it's really important that we recognise the three kinds or three categories of joints based on their structure. The first classification of joint are fibrous joints. Now you may know these as immovable joints. These by design allow no movement. We'll look at those in detail in a moment. The second classification of joint you may recognise are cartilaginous joints. These are slightly movable joints. And the third classification or category of joints are synovial joints. These are freely movable joints. So by structure, they allow none or some or lots of movement. And we're going to look at each one in detail. And you will need to be able to describe how these different categories of joints are structured and what their main function is. So let's start with fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are, they are fused together by this fibrous connective tissue. So maybe it's easy to remember fibrous joints, fibrous tissue connects them. And you can see the example of these flat bones of the cranium. They are fused together by fibrous tissue. It's called a suture joint, actually. There's clearly no cavity, there's no fluid. It is a sealed joint. We do not want movement between our cranial bones. So the detail I want you to remember is the structure of fibrous joints. They are connected with fibrous connective tissue like this. Okay, there's no gap, no cavity, because their main role is to allow no movement. They are immovable joints. We want them to be strong and stable. Ultimately, they're typically for protection. The fibrous joints of our sacrum are the fibrous joints of our pelvis. They all hold the bones together really tightly because we don't want them to move. They are protective joints. So you need to know a phrase or two to do with their structure, a phrase or two to do with their function, and examples. Cranial bones, the pelvic bones, really easy ones to remember. Here's an example of a question we've had. So there are 3 classifications of joints, synovial and cartilaginous are 2 of them. Describe using an example the third. So it's given you the 2 out of the 3 and it wants you to know the third for 4 marks. So not only do you need to state what the other classification is, you need to give information about it, what it's structured, what it does, its function, and give the name of an example to earn your 4 marks. Hopefully you would understand it's a fibrous joint. An example could be the cranium. It doesn't allow movement. It protects our brain in that example. Or you could give a different example. So just note that most of the mark schemes allow this. They say accept any other appropriate answer. So whichever example you give, as long as it's appropriate and makes sense and is correct, you'll get credit for it. Let's look at the second classification of joint then, cartilaginous joints. Now, the ones I want you to learn are in the vertebral column. So we've looked at these in previous videos. Here are some intervertebral or cartilage discs that sit between each of the vertebral bones all the way up the vertebral column. They have a really important job in terms of protection for us. There is another cartilaginous joint between your pubic bones at the front of your pelvis. There's also another cartilaginous joint where your ribs join your sternum, but I would suggest that it's this one that you learn as a rule. So structurally, what you need to know is this. Cartilaginous joints are connected by discs of fibrocartilage. Please learn that phrase, discs of fibrocartilage. And what also, the joints are stabilised by loads of ligaments. So again, your vertebral column is a good example. All these sticky out processes have ligaments attaching them and stabilising and holding them together and keeping them secure. What's the job of these cartilaginous joints? Well, generally speaking, it's the discs absorb shock. So when we jump, land, move, twist, turn, forces are applied through these joints, and these cartilage discs help absorb that impact and absorb that shock. These joints allow a little bit of movement in all directions, so we can do a little bit of rotation, a little bit of flexion extension, lateral flexion extension, all directions, but individually one joint only allows a little bit of movement. Collectively, that whole vertebral column allows a lot of movement. So, structure, discs of fibrocartilage, function, absorb shock, slight movement, bit of extra detail there for you, and examples, the vertebral column joints, of course not the sacrum and not the coccyx. So that leaves us the final classification of joint. The third classification of joint are synovial joints. Now you may know already that there are actually different kinds of synovial joints, subcategories of synovial joint. This video is not going to go into those. They're all pictured here. You might recognise them: gliding, hinge, pivot, ball and socket. That's the next 2 videos look at synovial joints in much more detail. For the purposes of this video, let's just look at the general structure of a synovial joint and its function. So within all of these types of synovial joint, what we'll find is the same components, the same sort of structure. They are different shape bones making up the joints, which we'll look at later. But overall, the structure has the same bits in the joint. They all have a joint capsule. They all have synovial membrane that produces synovial fluid. They're all stabilised by ligaments, and they've all got cartilage on the ends of the bones. And functionally, synovial joints are really about movement. These joints give us the biggest range of movement out of all 3 classifications of joint. Because they allow the biggest range of movement, they're the least stable of the joints. Compare this to a fibrous joint, much less stable. And of course, as I said, we'll look at the different types of synovial joint later. And these are all really important, all the movements we do in sport. These are the 6 names of the 6 types that you can see up here, which we will look at in the next 2 videos. Finally then, the exam question sample. Table 1 shows a classification of joint and an example of its location in the body. Complete the table by stating the 2 other classifications of joint. So it's given you one and given you one example. So for 4 marks, you've got to state the other 2 classifications in these boxes, and for each of them, you've got to give another example. It's given you fibrous in the example of the cranium. Hopefully you would appreciate some of the other options. There's obviously quite a lot of options you could have put as an example of a synovial joint. The cartilaginous joint, definitely you're going to put the vertebrae, the joints between the vertebrae, definitely. Synovial joint could be any number of joints, so pick one. 4 marks.